right, there we are. So we'll give it a minute to let everyone kind of settle and find the link, and then we'll start asking questions.
And they're seeing you or me or both?
Both. It'll switch off depending on who is speaking.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll just make a little screensaver.
Okay. Perfect. And also, as people join, they can always rewind, pause, all of the great YouTube things, just so that people know.
Okay. And the reading will stay up?
It will stay up forever unless we do something extra embarrassing, and then I will delete it right away.
Okay. Okay. We can take a poll at the end and see if it's a keeper.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the first ever Sundance Books and Music live stream. We're so happy that we could be here today with Christopher Coake so that he can share his new book, You Would Have Told Me Not To, with the world. Yeah. Today's reading, like all of our in-store readings, is made possible in partnership with the Nightingale Family Foundation and Nevada Humanities. My name is Emily Bennett. I am the events coordinator and marketing manager here at Sundance, and I'm so happy to welcome Christopher Coake. Just tell you a few things about him. You Would Have Told Me Not To is his latest collection of stories. It's his third. He also has the novel You Came Back and the story collection We're in Trouble. He is an associate professor of English at the University of Nevada, Reno, where he directs the MFA program in creative writing. And he lives here in Reno with his wife, Stephanie Lauer. So welcome to the live stream, Chris.
Thank you. Thanks for that introduction, Emily. Thanks for setting all of this up. And thanks as always to Sundance Books for being great for this community and for readers and writers everywhere. Thanks especially for the really cool backdrop you've got behind you with the sparkly lights. Yeah, it was really classy. Thank you.
Very high tech. If anyone has ever wondered what the third floor is like on Sundance Books and Music, it's a lot of books with fairy tale lighting like that.
Yeah, and they're all mine. That's what lives on the third floor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So now you know. After I'm going to read for about 25 minutes and tell you a little bit about this book. After that, and during the reading, you can ask questions via YouTube, right?
Yes.
You can type them in as comments. Emily is going to be compiling questions. She's going to write down good ones to ask when it's all over. I don't have the YouTube window up just because I can't walk and chew gum at the same time. If you would be so kind, if you do ask a question and it's the sort of question that you don't want to keep anonymous, if you're somebody I know, please let me know who's asking so I can kind of address you specifically. As I told Emily beforehand, it's nerve-wracking to do a reading in front of a lot of people. It's even more nerve-wracking to do a reading here in my kitchen, talking to the screen. So I don't know how many of you are out there. But thank you for being here. Thanks for, even clicking on this later if that's what you're doing to hear anything about this book. So this is a story collection. It's 7 stories, 6 shorter ones and 1 novella. It's called You Would Have Told Me Not To. The title comes from one of the stories I'm going to read from a little bit here later. When I was writing this book, and when I knew that it was going to be a book and was finishing it up, I was telling people this is my quote unquote toxic masculinity book, which is a little bit reductive, but more or less that was what I was thinking about when I was finishing this up. Masculinity has been a topic of my writing throughout my career. I grew up in the cornfields of Indiana as an artsy kid. There were a lot of people around me who didn't understand that, and the kind of prevailing images I had of what it was to be a grown-up man were very different than the kind of man I imagined myself being. Another thing I've been telling people as I promote this book is that I grew up with a really complicated dad who was alcoholic, and he was abusive to my mom. It was kind of a scary place to be a kid. And those are things that I've had to think about my entire life, which is not to say that I have been, a perfect angel and example throughout my life. I haven't. And those are also things that I was thinking about as I was writing this book. I'm coming up on 50 years old. I have a lot of past now to look back on and think about. If I had a time machine on my way back to kill baby Hitler, I would want to stop and talk to younger me and tell him a lot that older me knows. So many of the characters in this book are people who are having to face up to their past and who have made bad mistakes and are trying to reckon with them, or just becoming aware that there is something there to reckon with. The other thing I want to say before we get started, yesterday was the day the book came out. That started off a really exciting day, and in the afternoon, very suddenly, we had to put down a dog. If you know me, you know how much I care about dogs. If you've known me over the last 10 years, you know how much I care about Dashiell Hammett, my canine shadow. He's no longer with us. So if I am reading and I stare off into the middle distance, one of two things is happening. I'm either thinking about my dog, or I have noticed something in the language of the book that I wish I could edit on the spot. Either way, let me work through it. Don't click away. We'll get right back to the subject at hand. So I'm going to start off by reading the first few pages of the very first story in the book. Most of these stories were written within the last few years. This is a story actually that I wrote way back in 2006, but which I always liked and which really fit in well and kind of sets the tone for this collection. If you are a student or a colleague of mine teaching in Franzen Humanities, it might interest you to know that I finished this story at an all-nighter at the Esther Early Library up on the second floor. My in-laws were visiting and I was on deadline. The end. This is a story called That First Time. Again, we're just gonna go through the first few pages and then I'll tell you a little bit more. I practiced reading from the actual book and from a PDF off the screen. This is much less disconcerting. So, analog. That First Time. Bob Klein was sitting at his computer, reading and then deleting a number of old letters from his soon-to-be ex-wife, Yvonne, when he received an email from a sender he didn't know. Its subject line contained a name, Annabeth Cole, he didn't recognize either. The email read, "Is this the Bobby Klein who went to Westover High School in 1988? If so, I'm sorry to inform you that Annabeth Cole died several months ago. She wanted you to know. If you have any questions, call me. I'm sorry to bring you bad news." At the bottom of the message was a number and a name, Vicki Jeffords. Bob stared at the email for a long time, not understanding it at all, his eyes still damp and blurred from the hour he'd spent reading Yvonne's old love letters. He tried now to pull his thoughts together. Annabeth Cole? He was the Bob Klein this Vicki wanted, but as far as he could remember, he'd never gone to school with an Annabeth. He dug for a while in his closet, pulled out his yearbook. He didn't see an Annabeth in his class, or a Vicki, for that matter. He went to the kitchen and opened a can of beer. Then he called the number Vicki had given him. A woman answered after 2 rings. "This is Bob Klein," he said. "Vicki, you emailed me?" "Bobby," she said. "Yes, this is Vicki. Thanks for calling." Her voice was completely unfamiliar. "Sure," he said. "Listen, I'm the guy you want, but I have to say I'm a little confused. I don't remember going to school with an Annabeth." "Annabeth Cole," she said. "Yeah, help me out. How did I know her? Did I know you?" After a few seconds of silence, she said, "Not as well as you knew Annabeth. You slept with her once, if that narrows it down any." He looked up at the ceiling. "I did?" "Yeah, she and I went to Oak Park. She met you at oh, and then Bob knew. Annie," he said, "holy shit." He sat down hard on his couch. Annie. It had been what, 18 years? He'd forgotten her last name. And if she'd ever told him her full name was Annabeth, he'd forgotten that too. A picture of her came into his mind, a small, slender girl, long, sandy-colored hair, glasses. He'd only known her a week, if that. They had slept together just once when he was 17. He'd never spoken to her again. He asked how. "Cancer," she said. non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Vicky told him the story while he stared at the beer can on his knee. She'd been Annie's best friend since grade school. And Bobby had met Vicky too after he met Annabeth. Did he remember? At the pizza place? He told her he did, but this was mostly a lie. He remembered a girl sitting across the booth while he flirted, a placeholder shape in his memory. Was she tall? Maybe blonde? Vicky told him she'd gone to stay with Annabeth in Chicago for the month before Annabeth died. Toward the very end, they talked a lot about the old days and about what to do when Annabeth was gone, and she'd written Bob's name on a list of people who might want to hear the news. Vicky had been tracking everyone down. There are a lot of Bob Kleins, she said. You're a hard man to find. She then told him about the service 3 months past. He tried to follow the details, but he was still too stunned, still trying to figure out why he'd gotten this call. When she was quiet again, he said, look, I guess I don't remember Annie and me ending on the best of terms back then. I don't either, Vicky said. Was she still angry with me? It was a stupid question, and he knew at the moment the words were in the air. Vicky said, well, you were her first time. Yeah, he said, rubbing a knot at the base of his skull. And it was kind of intense for her. I mean, the whole thing. She was pretty messed up after you dumped her. Yeah, he said again. Vicky said, well, she thought you might remember her and that you'd want to know. I do, he said. Listen, Vicky. He could barely believe he was saying it. I'm not like I was then. I mean, I was 17. She was such a sweet girl. If I could do it over, hey, Vicky said. We were kids. He couldn't even picture the outlines of the girl Vicky had been, but he could see her now on the other end of the phone, a middle-aged woman with her head in her hand, tired and sad. He wanted to say something else to her, to console her. But while he was thinking of what that might be, she said, I should go. I'm sorry, Bobby. When she'd hung up, Bob went to the patio doors and opened the blinds. He lived in an apartment overlooking downtown Indianapolis, 15 floors up. The sun was setting and the city lights were coming on, which was more or less the best thing that happened to him anymore, and he liked to keep the appointment. He'd been separated from Yvonne for 6 months and hadn't been doing much since but working, and then coming home to sit out on his balcony at night, drinking and watching the lights come on, telling himself they were doing the right thing. His head was pounding now. He decided the circumstances called for a switch from beer to bourbon for a little impromptu wake. He picked up a bottle and glass from the kitchen and took them both to the balcony. A helicopter darted overhead. Next door, he could hear a lot of people talking, the sound of music playing, jazz. He had classy neighbors on that side. He finished the bourbon in his glass and tried to find grief for poor Annie in his swimming head. It was somewhere outside of him, but faint, like the music he could just hear through the walls from next door. Annie Cole. He'd broken her heart. Not on purpose, but all the same, he had. He meant all of what he'd said to Vicky. She had been a sweet girl and he'd been stupidly cruel. When he'd thought of Annie these past 18 years, it was to wish her a happy life, a good husband, a big yard with kids and dogs. Had she told him she wanted those things? Or had he simply given them to her in his mind? He couldn't remember. He lifted his glass, first to the party next door, then to the big, glittery, mirror-windowed office building across the street where a few sad souls still worked. In this light, he could just see them, ghost-like, through the reflective glass. To Annie, he thought. He wasn't a religious man, but for her sake, he hoped there was a heaven, someplace far away from loneliness, from sickness, from people like him. So we're going to stop that story there. This is not 35 pages of Bob staring off into the distance, thinking about bad things. He does actually do some things. In fact, he and Vicky strike up something like a friendship. Both of them kind of thinking about the grief that they have in them, which takes very different forms. But I'm not going to spoil anything more in the story than that. So the next one I'm going to read from is the title story. You would have told me not to. Originally, the book was going to be called Big Guy. That's the name of the final story I'll read from. But my editor, the very fine editor and novelist Joseph Olshan, who I hope is watching, convinced me that this would be the way to go. That made 3 book titles out of 3 that are addresses to another human being. So I guess I have a brand now, but you would have told me not to. This is a story I wrote just a few years ago. It's broken up into mini chapters. And one of the things I wanted to do with this story was to surprise readers every few pages. Whatever you think you're reading is going to change in tone and in plot whenever there's a new chapter. So I'm going to read the first chapter from this and just a few paragraphs from the next one to show you one of those changes. And I think you'll get a sense of what it's about once I start reading. You would have told me not to. 1. Just after midnight, Suzanne stopped for gas on the Indiana-Ohio border. Next to the gas station was a liquor store. Without much hesitation, she went inside and bought a handful of miniature whiskey bottles. She drank one in the parking lot, then checked her phone one more time. She still had no messages from Abby, Sean, a doctor, anyone. She called the hospital one more time and received the same runaround. Sean had been admitted, and that was all that they would reveal. She said unkind things and hung up. When she'd gotten her Buick back to speed on the interstate, snow swirled past her windshield in a manner she could only describe as malevolent. The liquor burned in her belly, and she focused on it, used it as a platform from which she could step back into her best and most rational self. 50 more miles of mostly empty highway, though, and she was back to remembering herself and Sean at their worst, what she had sworn she would not do, since her son's girlfriend, Abby, had called 2 hours ago and left a message that he'd been shot. She hadn't spoken with Sean since early August, when he had called to tell her he was quitting his graduate program in anthropology. There was a reason to want a drink. The last conversation she might ever have had with her only child had been an argument, an ugly one. From the tone of his voice, too honeyed and placating, he'd learned that trick from his father, and the over-solicitous way he'd asked after Miguel and the bank branch that she managed. She'd known what he was calling to tell her. She began to rage, not only because of Sean's irresponsibility, though, God, definitely because of that, but because of his predictability. Sean told her his reasons. His heart wasn't in it, the work wasn't engaging him, but she filled in the real answers. You're quitting because grad school asked you to work very hard and you don't like to. Because I wrote you several large checks last year to make grad school happen, and some part of you takes joy in wasting my money. You're quitting because you know I wanted this for you. You're quitting because you asked your father first, and I just know he told you to follow your heart, and your father is full of shit. She said none of this aloud. What had she expected? She'd been too eager to help him, after all, too eager for him to make something of himself, too eager to write in the checks, too exultant the night she'd toasted him in front of Abby, calling him Dr. Sipes. Finally, she couldn't listen to him anymore. She'd interrupted and told Sean she was disappointed in him, that he was 27 and too old to be leaving things like this unfinished, that sooner or later he'd have to make up his mind about who he was. She couldn't decide that for him. I never asked you to, he said. Jesus, Mom, you're a really awful person sometimes. Do you know that? He hung up, and she'd never called him back. They often went weeks without talking, but this last silence had lasted nearly 3 months. Abby's message tonight had been frantic, tearful. Sean's been shot. We're going to Riverside Hospital. Come quick. She'd not called again, and her phone was going to voicemail. Suzanne had tried calling Sean's father, Rick, in London, but he didn't answer either. Sean could very well be dead by now, a long pale form beneath a sheet. Suzanne imagined a doctor, tall and serious, wearily stripping off bloodied latex gloves. No, remember something else. Remember him as a baby again, as fat at birth as he would someday be tall, squalling wetly in her arms, smelling both sweet and obscene, her body turned inside out and given to her to hold. She had loved him. Let no one ever doubt that she had loved him. But she was someone, be honest, she heard her therapist say, for whom relationships were complicated. And even then, even when he was a baby, the love she'd felt for her boy had been tinged with a bitter doom. I can't, she thought, feeling him begin to nurse. I can't do this. I'll ruin him. Be honest. More than once, she had thought, he'll ruin me. She could still feel the weight of him then, the breath trickling out of him, the delicate redness of his skin. How fragile, how impermanent he'd seemed. She could have cut him open with a fingernail. 2. Sean was not only alive. When Suzanne entered his room an hour and a half later, she found him sitting up and laughing. Abby leaned across the bed, her hands clasped on his stomach. In her dazed and puffy face, Suzanne saw at least some evidence that another human being had been through hell tonight too. Sean's face was drawn. He was skinnier. He'd lost weight, and his right arm was in a sling. He was pale, his chin coated by several days' stubble. A long brown scribble of dried blood rose from under his gown and ended in a smear below his earlobe. "Mama," he cried, holding out his free arm. "Baby boy," she said. She heard herself say it, and, helpless, rushed to him, buried her face into the crook of his neck, which was warm and smelled of blood. He'd been shot through the biceps, she learned. She trailed a surgeon out of the room and got the full report. The bullet had traveled cleanly through the muscle, missing arteries and major nerves, which, the doctor told her, had been the most advantageous path it could have taken. "It could have missed him," Suzanne said. "My understanding," the doctor told her, smiling proudly as though Sean were his own son, "is that Sean was shot protecting his wife, shielding her and the baby." Suzanne stopped herself from asking, "His wife? Who's that? And why had they been holding a baby?" But when she returned to the room, Abby was standing up, and Suzanne saw clearly that she was pregnant and well along, too. Oh, and Abby and Sean were both wearing rings on the proper fingers. Oh, again. Sean was drowsy with painkiller. He smiled up at her, heartbreakingly sweet. "Mama," he said, slurring, "you must be so mad at me." We're going to stop it there. The story goes on for several more chapters. I don't want to say it's a comedy, but it has some funny stuff. I tried to put funny things in there anyway. It ends up being a story about a few people having to spend some time they didn't expect in a very small apartment, all moving around each other and all the stuff that they've done to each other in the past. And Suzanne has to come to terms with the fact that she's going to be a grandmother, and also the fact that she had a relationship with her son such that he didn't want to tell her. That's where the title of that story comes from. When she finally confronts him, "Why didn't you tell me?" He says it as a joke. You would have just told me not to. And that's something that lives with her for a long time. So the last thing I'm going to read for you tonight is the first part, just the first few pages of the final piece in the book. That is a novella called Big Guy. It's this much of the book. This is a thing I'm really proud of. It was hard to write. A lot of the things in this book were hard to write, but this was in particular hard to write. This is the part where I remind everybody that I'm a fiction writer. This is a story about a guy who teaches English in Reno, Nevada, who struggles with his weight. You might, if you've talked to me at all over the last few years, recognize a few of those things as applying to me too, but it's not me. I trained when I was an undergraduate to be a high school English teacher, and I did my student teaching at Delta High School in the cornfields of Indiana, and loved it, and realized that if I went down that career path, I'd never write a word of my own again. So I shocked everybody by leaving that profession, and I went to grad school to study creative writing and derped around for a little while and finally ended up here. But I have, over the years, made fun of that alternate version of myself, the guy who went off and became a high school teacher. And for whatever reason, the caricature that I've always made of him is that he's a lot bigger than I am. And I'm not a small human being most of the time. So, it finally kind of occurred to me as I was thinking about a lot of stuff over the last few years, not least, what it means to be a large male in the world today. And that was a question I had to ask myself. Why am I fat shaming my alter ego for, why do I hate him so much? So I wanted to write a story about him, and he became a high school teacher in Reno. And he also became somebody who is a really, I think, dicey guy in a lot of ways, which is not to suggest I'm not. But The other thing that I was thinking about when writing the story is just, I had the realization a few years back that when I was in my mid-20s, my metabolism just hit a brick wall and stopped, and I've been large to some extent ever since. I have probably lost in aggregate in different chunks at different times over 250 pounds since my 20s. I lose it, I gain it back. I lose it, I gain it back. In 1999, my first wife passed away, and I was very heavy when that happened. And in the year after she died, I committed myself to being small again, and I lost something like 80 pounds. So all of that stuff went into this story. It's about a guy who decides he's going to lose 100 pounds. But I think I've told you the extent to which the autobiography enters into it. I'm going to shut up and just read you part of the fiction. This is a story, it's broken up into parts, but you're only going to hear one, so I don't have to introduce it that way. This is Big Guy. Doug Ritchie had heard the nickname for years, and he'd never allowed himself to mind it. He had no right to mind. He was, after all, a fat man, 6'2", and somewhere to the north of 300 pounds. He saw what he saw in the mirror. What use was pretending others couldn't? Big Guy, people called him. Big man, big fella. On the last day of school every May, before his senior high students left him for the world beyond, he delivered a farewell speech to his last class. Doing so was corny, but he believed in what he told them, and each graduating class of students had come to expect it from him. In the speech, he urged them to follow their dreams, as he had his, and reminded them they had all the tools within them to do so. He told them that he wished for them to keep reading and researching and writing, and by doing this to seek out ways to know themselves better. He knew they would come through any crisis just fine as long as they kept remembering to seek their best selves. You have to know who you are, he would say, in order to be happy in this world. Doug would say, if he was asked, that he was happy with his life. He was married to a woman he loved, Wendy Spalding, whom he'd met in college. And he had a job he liked in which he did well, teaching junior and senior English and journalism at Hunter High School in suburban Reno. He'd learned enough about the world's horrors. He taught Beloved, Fahrenheit 451, The Handmaid's Tale, not to complain about his place. He was a white, middle class, upper middle, if he was being honest, given Wendy's salary, male, which made him one of the luckiest people who'd ever lived. He knew all of this about himself. And if what he told his students was to mean anything, that you had to see yourself clearly and without self-deception, then he had to acknowledge he was fat. Even so, the nicknames could rankle him, the way people felt comfortable labeling him, assuming his own comfort with himself. People from whom he needed repairs were especially fond of doing so. He'd pull up to the body shop and a mechanic would happily cry out, "What you need, big man?" A plumber would emerge from the hall bathroom, wiping his hands on a rag. "All done, big fella." These people were always men, always smaller, stronger, people from whom he needed work that he could not himself do. He heard the nicknames most often from servers at restaurants, those people from whom, especially, he could keep no secrets. They'd appear toward the end of his meals out with Wendy and ask, "Any dessert for you folks? How about you, big guy?" The server would raise an eyebrow, and even though inwardly Doug cringed, he would laugh, because it helped to be in on the joke, didn't it? And take a menu. After it was set in motion, Doug came to believe his divorce had begun with that very question and his answer. Wendy claimed to have been planning on telling him she wanted out of the marriage for a long time, but Doug was unable, in those sleepless hours just afterward, to ignore the circumstances during which she finally had. They'd been out to dinner in May of 2013, a little past 14 years into their marriage. He'd been gaining weight steadily almost the entire time. That weight gain had happened for many reasons, but the most basic among them was that Doug was almost never in the habit of turning down a dessert. They were finishing up their meal at a nice restaurant buried deep within a casino in downtown Reno, where they'd lived since just after their marriage. The school year had just ended. He'd given his final speech to the students hours before, and the two of them were ostensibly celebrating the onset of summer. Even so, dinner had been quiet, ominously in retrospect. But at the time, Wendy had only claimed she was working through a headache. She'd put on a nice dress, had done her makeup, put up her auburn hair away from her neck, as she knew he liked. She had still managed to tell him the latest news about the politics of her office, had listened to him update her on the politics of the teacher's lounge, had laughed and grimaced at the points he expected she might. He ordered steak frites, and she had a beet salad. He cleaned his plate. Wendy, as was her habit, pushed around her salad and drank 2 glasses of wine. At the end of the meal, the server appeared, a tanned, fit snowboarder type, his hair pulled into a top knot, and asked the magic words. Did we save any room for dessert? How about you, big guy? Doug smiled and played his part. He ordered a slice of key lime cheesecake. You? He asked Wendy. He always asked her, even though she was thin, could still fit into her college clothes, because she nearly always turned down dessert. She shook her head, and he thought then, for the first time, that she seemed troubled. Maybe her headache had gotten worse. Maybe her dinner had made her sick. When the server had left, he asked her, "What's wrong?" She withdrew her hand from underneath his and said, "I can't do this anymore." Though she went on immediately, her voice taking on speed and force, to tell him what she meant, that she wanted a divorce, that she'd fallen in love with one of her fellow attorneys, Ed Pinecki, that she had known for a long time that their marriage had failed. She spoke those first words, "I can't do this anymore," with a kind of awe, as though she was revealing the truth of herself for the first time. And though they would experience a great deal of ugliness in the coming 2 years, Doug was always able to recall that when she said those words, before she went on, his first thought was to offer his help. Whatever this was, his urge was to take it on himself. She talked to him for several more minutes, stopping only when the waiter dropped off Doug's cheesecake. It sat untouched between them as she continued to speak. This was when the import of what she was saying really sank in, and he began to cry with the helplessness of a small child. "Why don't you go to the car?" Wendy said, not unkindly. "I'll pay up." He wanted the memory to be different later, but he could not make it so. He walked quickly out of the restaurant, shoulders hunched, then hurried through the clamor of the casino floor to the elevators. He then wept behind the wheel of their car until Wendy arrived a few minutes later. He saw her approach in the side mirror, her slim, bare arms hanging at her sides, her steps measured and calm. He noticed, part of him noticed it right away, that she was carrying only her purse. She had not gotten a box for his cheesecake. He noticed himself noticing, and then an abyss opened, and he knew he was never going to undo this. They were really and truly done. Later during that long night, after hours of trying to undo it anyway, he said to her, "It's because I got fat, isn't it? Say it. Have the courage to say it." She shook her head wearily. "No, Doug, it's not that." She said, "It's that you stopped trying a long time ago." Though he could have interpreted that answer in a number of ways, he heard what he thought he needed to. Wendy did not love him anymore, and that was because he had stopped trying to be lovable, because he stopped trying to be desirable, because he was too big, too ugly, too far gone, too fat. There was nothing more to say. When dawn broke, he loaded 2 suitcases and several bags of books into his car and drove to a motel. And there he began his new life alone. So I'm going to stop there. There's a lot more to go. The story covers 2 years of time, more or less, and Doug goes through a lot of changes, not all of them good. Again, that's not even much of a spoiler. Losing weight is not his issue, and he's going to have to learn a lot about what his issue is. But that's what I'm going to read from tonight. Again, there are more stories we haven't touched upon. So if anybody's got any questions, please do send them my way.
Yeah, that was amazing, Chris. Thank you.
Thank you.
A lot of us don't want you to stop. I'm seeing in the comments.
Too bad. You have to go buy the book. Buy it from someone else.
Just get a taste. I have a question while we wait for everyone else's questions to come in. That middle story you read about the mother, I noticed, and then some of our friends in the comments also noticed the beautiful line, her body turned inside out. and given to her to hold. How do you, as a writer, as a male writer, and you're primarily writing about masculinity, how do you then switch over and write a story from such a female perspective, not just being a woman, but also giving birth and having your child out in the world?
Well, I mean, it's not a magic trick. Like I know a lot of people who are moms, including my own mom, who I hope is watching tonight. And I keep my ears open. I don't have kids. My wife, Stephanie, and I decided a long time ago not to have kids. And in some ways, I think because I don't have kids, that's let a lot of the parents I know talk to me about some of the less sentimental parts of child rearing. So I've heard a lot of things, over the past couple of decades about what it's like. I've read a lot of stuff about what it's like. Some of it is just a good guess. I mean, the thing about writing stories is that story took a long time to write, and it wasn't just me sort of like magically pulling images out of the air. There were a lot of things I wrote for that story that didn't work and that seemed wrong and false. And, and there might still be things in this book, that I write about people who are not me that might seem wrong and false. That's always the risk one takes when one tries it. But something that I can read very quickly and something that people apprehend very quickly is something that takes a long time to get nailed in. I don't think that we can ever assume that a writer who seems to be empathetic in a sentence can actually like summon that as they walk down the street. So thank you. I'm glad. I like the line too. I'm glad it worked, but in some ways it was a lucky guess based on just paying attention to the things that people have told me.
Great. So we have a few questions.
Okay, good.
Someone has asked about, so they say, I'm curious how writing these stories was different or similar to those in We're in Trouble.
The smart ass answer is that the death toll in We're in Trouble, my first book of stories, is something like 14. I killed everybody in We're in Trouble, including 2 dogs. Okay. Like I'm really proud of that book, but if you read it, it's, don't take it on vacation with you. This is a story. I mean, there are people who've died off screen in these stories. But the death toll is really non-existent. Like there was a story in my first book that was perceived as a mystery story. It made it into Best American Mysteries that year, about a guy who murders his entire family. And there are no, I had to describe this book to somebody recently as like, there are no crimes in this at all except emotional ones. And that might or might not be accurate now that I think about a couple of stories, but really this was one that I wanted to focus a little bit more on the complexities of just living with other people, and to try and, as I mentioned earlier, I lost a spouse in 1999, and I wrote that first book in the couple of years after that happened. And grief was very much on my mind. My novel is about grief in a lot of ways too. So this was a book where I wanted to get into a little bit different territory. Read it for yourself and judge whether I managed to do it. But I also wanted to not, I didn't want to have my head up my own navel quite as much for this one. So I really did want to try and look around and see other types of people than the ones I've traditionally written about. It's still very much a book that I could write. And I know if you've read my other stuff, you'll see a lot of that in here too. I guess the final thing I'd say is that these stories they're not as experimental in form. One of the things that was really influential to me when I was writing my first book was I took a class in French cinema from a professor, Judith Main, who I still keep in touch with. Judith, you might be watching. Hi. But that class was really, I was watching a bunch of the French New Wave and seeing these directors who were telling stories in all these weird and chopped up ways. And that's what I wanted to do. So that first book is full of experiments. I think it's a really readable book, but there are stories there's one told backwards, and there's a couple that play really interesting tricks on the page. These are just they're not, well, they're not just, they're a little bit more traditionally told, I would say. They have beginnings and ends, and I break them up into chapters a little bit, but I'm not trying to, spin the camera around the room and change up anything in that way. I wanted to, as much as possible, just kind of get out of the way of these stories and let them tell themselves as much as I could. That seemed to be the right way to go. I reserve the right at any point to do something experimental again in the future. I really have fun with that.
Of course.
But I guess those are the biggest differences.
Okay.
I'm reading my book a lot. It's my safety blanket tonight.
All right. Well, someone has a question. They say, as a fellow Hoosier,
Yay.
as someone who left Indiana and now lives somewhere very different, do you feel like you write about the Midwest differently than if you'd stayed?
Boy, that made me think about being my alter ego again. I'm also trying to think who asked that question. I've got an answer in mind. When I moved here to Reno, which is almost 15 years ago now, from Columbus, Ohio, the first thing I could think to do was write a novel about Columbus, Ohio, a place which doesn't really exist in the national imagination at all, unless you follow college football. And they're getting some perspective on it helped a lot. I have a very complex relationship with Indiana. Without question, I'm a Hoosier kid still. I grew up in rural Indiana. I went to high school at a place which, no joke, had cornfields on 3 sides and a graveyard on the 4th. And that was a metaphor for me when I was a kid. But I don't want to rag on it all the time. It is a place that has a lot of problems for me, not only because of my childhood there and stuff that I associate with it, but also because, I always felt like I had to fight a little bit to like the things that I liked. I was a comic book nerd. I played a lot of Dungeons and Dragons. I still play some Dungeons and Dragons. I didn't want to be a farmer. I didn't want to be an athlete. My high school made the decision to offer honor roll students academic letter jackets. And there was a huge fight about this from the parents of kids who were earning athletic letter jackets. And so the academic letter jackets had to be different, and it was a whole thing. And by the time they gave them to us, we didn't want to wear them anymore. It was an extraordinary, I can't emphasize to you watching enough how white a place it was. Okay. I didn't meet any people of color who would admit that until I was a senior in high school. We had one Black student in my graduating class of 140 some. I didn't meet anybody who even identified as Jewish until I went to college. So, being from a place means it's always within you, but there's a lot of Indiana that I've had to, work to get rid of. Whether people, were open about it or not, it was a really racist place. It was a terribly homophobic place. Difference was just not rewarded there. I know a lot of people who are really fine human beings who still live there and try to, do their best there and make that a good place. But when I write about it now, I guess this is a long-winded way of saying that when I write about the Midwest now, I'm in some ways looking back and having to fight through a lot of the displeasure with it. And that's not a knock against anybody who lives there and loves it. But I'm happy with it over there. I'm happy to be in this troubling, weird place where we live, which has its own issues and is certainly not, heaven by any means. But being separate from a place also makes one sentimental about it. I think that I can write a little bit better about Indiana and Ohio because now being over here, I'm allowed to miss it. When I was in my 20s and trying desperately to figure out a way to leave, it was a little bit harder to see those sorts of things. And I would have been, I think, less fair to those places. Now, though, Columbus, Ohio is a great city. If I had to go back to the Midwest, Columbus, Ohio, or Minneapolis, or Bloomington, Indiana, those are really, really cool places to be, depending on where you are and the people you're around.
What season it is.
Yeah. But it's also really humid there. I live in the desert now, and I love not having humidity and no mosquitoes and all of that.
Hmm.
So maybe that's relevant to that question.
Okay, and that they wanted me to tell you, and I'm sorry, I'm going to butcher your name, was from Shindell Beers?
Yeah. Hi, Shandell.
Shandell, sorry, excuse me.
She's
So we have
who
another,
now lives in Oregon.
oh, another transplant.
Yep.
So this comes from Adam C. He says, you do a great job of portraying positive traits of your characters alongside the bad. Was that a struggle when portraying the topic of toxic masculinity that is focused on in this collection?
Yes. Hi, Adam C. Another Hoosier, if it's the Adam C. I'm thinking about. Yeah, it was. It was. I mean, I have pretty strong opinions about things. If I have my assessment of my major weakness as a writer is that I can be really moralistic. I grew up with kind of a sense of right and wrong that was taken from J.R.R. Tolkien, which, you know, is exciting to read, right? But the world is, I was going to say we don't have an actual Sauron in this world, but maybe we do right now. So I'll back off that a little bit. But yeah, I can be pretty rigid about right and wrong. And, you know, the older I'm coming up on 50 years old and I've screwed up a lot. And, you know, my own sense of right and wrong was not going to allow me to live comfortably unless I had to admit that people are more complicated than sometimes I want to give them room to be. And I think you can see that in my first two books. There's there's that stern, you know, judgment hanging over everything, which I don't necessarily like when I read it in other people's writing. So yeah, I wanted to write about people who'd done bad things, but I also wanted to be neutral about it. I wanted to put a camera on them as much as I could, and when I could, to give them a chance to say things in their own words. There's a story I didn't read from in here called Waste, which is, I think, a pretty good one. You know, it was a hard one to write too. And it's from the perspective of the most disturbing character I've ever tried to inhabit. He's a really violent alcoholic. He's this far from being homeless, you know, which is not a bad thing for, you know, a lot of folks, but for this person is definitely the result of his own choices and sense of isolation. He has been abusive to people. He's racist. He's homophobic. You know, he's like a lot of people I met growing up. And I had tried to write from the perspective of a character like that for a long time. And it wasn't until I did this story that I was finally able to get through it. And still, you know, this story, it's been one where I've been nervous about putting some things on the page. The very fine journal Booth out of Butler University in Indianapolis published it. And we had some talks at the last minute about some language this guy uses. We changed it a little bit more for the story collection here. And that's the trick with a story like that. This is not a story. If anything, it's kind of the reverse of that. This guy is not out for redemption, and if anything, it's a story about him, you know, choosing to be as isolated as possible because I think he understands he's dangerous. And so, you know, again, it's one of those empathy questions. It took a long time to build him on the page in that way, where he would be someone you wanted to spend a little bit of time with just to find out what happens to him, but also where I want readers to come away. I want readers to know that I know what he is, you know, and the way that I could do that was, and I think the way that I did it with some other characters in the book was to have them start to open their eyes to who they are. That lets them be moralistic and not me, if that makes any sense at all.
Right.
Thanks, Adam, for saying so. I hope you think so after you read the book.
All right, we have time for a few more questions.
Okay.
So I'm not sure if this person wants me to say their name, so I'll just read the comment. It says,
Okay.
Love these stories. For 20 years, I've been jealous of your ability to write in such a close third person. How do you get so close into your characters' minds, and why third person rather than first person?
Okay, thank you. I love close third person. Close third person is dreamy to me. Close third person lets you do a little bit of voice, but it also shuts the characters up when they need to. Yeah, when I try to write in first person, the stories get really, really long and bloated. And not all the time, but usually I have trouble letting those characters I just let them go and go and go, and it's hard for me to stop them. The one I was just talking about, Waste, is narrated in the first person, which is another thing that made me nervous about that one. But I heard that guy's voice really clearly. Again, I met a lot of people like that when I was a kid. And for me, a first person story is one that has to be told that way. That there's a reason for that character to want to represent themselves and to kind of argue for or against themselves. I love reading first person from other people. I'm jealous of people who can do it well and who gravitate naturally toward it. But and this might go along with being a little moralistic, there's a part of me that likes having a slight narratorial hand in all of it, which is harder to get away with in first person. Third, limited, as much as I love it, that's its downfall, is you'll always kind of hear me in the background, or you'll hear that capital N narrator moving the ship along. But I write stories that are pretty long as it is. I gotta pull some tricks just to make them get done under 10,000 words if I can.
Right. So we have another question from a writer friend that says, I'd love to hear Chris talk about talking. That is, how does he approach and develop dialogue and conversations in his stories? Something he does so well.
These are really nice questions, Emily. Are you reading them as they're actually written?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. That's very nice. I cut a lot. When I get stuck in a story, a lot of times the way that I get unstuck, well, sometimes I just give up and go watch Mystery Science Theater. But when I'm being really good, I will just sit a couple of characters down and have them start talking to each other. If you could see the files of all the stuff I cut out of my stories, you would be bored senseless. It's just like X and Y sit down and have a cup of coffee. X is mad at Y. What are you mad about? And, I just have them kind of workshop this together. The novel I wrote in 2012 was really instructive. When, that was drafted, it was something like 200,000 words, and we had to employ a freelance editor, the great Ann Patty, who published my first book. Anne was pretty brutal with me to cut that book down to 115,000 words. And when I read it now, I think it could get down under 100. But a lot of what we cut was the talking. I think what I hadn't learned, especially at that length, was how to get conversations dialed into their bare minimum. It's easy for me to say when I'm teaching students about writing, like conversation needs to do more than one thing. It needs to both move the plot along and reveal character. Characters never quite say what's on their minds. It's really dramatic when they do, but for the most part, all of us, when we're in discussion with each other, are probably frantically trying to hide, our worst impulses. But that's what I do now, is I just try to make sure that the very, as little as I need makes it onto the page. And every editor who's worked with me has cut a little bit more out of that. Joe Olshan, my editor on this book, had me write 2 new stories for this collection. And that's a lot of what we were talking about at the very last minute. Like, these 5 pages, make them 3. You can do it. So, again, like, if you like what you see on the page, there's probably a lot of work and argument that happened off the page. And I probably was wrong at a certain point and had to be told what to do. If you know me in real life, I can go on forever. So, it's definitely like a muscle I have to exercise on the page in order to be minimalistic about dialogue. I also, if I'm being really good too, I try to read it out loud. If I read something and it sounds like a couple of people doing community theater, with an amateur playwright, then it's time to go back and try to make that a little bit more naturalistic.
We have 2 questions that I'm kind of going to put together.
Okay.
So someone asked how you decided to change the title to You Would Have Told Me Not To from Big Guy. And someone else asked how you get the color scheme you want on your book cover, and if there's a correct way to say you hate a particular color. So how much say do you have in those things, and how do those things kind of come about? This
might be my editor asking the question. Okay. So yeah, it was called Big Guy, and Joe Olshan, my editor, he's a novelist too, and a very, very good one. You should go check out his books. Nice guy. Joe, he really loved that story, and he told me, I really want to change the title of the book to You Would Have Told Me Not To. And I don't remember exactly. We have like 300 emails between us as the book was getting finished. I might have been polite about it or might not. Internally, I was like, no, I really like Big Guy. I had, cover ideas and everything for it. And I would buy a book called Big Guy, but Joe prevailed. My only objection to You Would Have Told Me Not To is that it's 3 books in a row that are like conversations with other people. And like, really, that's my brand? My next book, you'll put your eye out, kid, story. It seemed like a good idea at the time. But yeah, I came around to it. I really did. Because it's a more expansive title, especially the 2 stories that Joe had me write for the book. Those, I think, fit. They were shaped a lot by knowing that this was going to be its title. This title talks about relationships. It talks about not only screwing up, but knowing that that you're disappointing somebody else. The joke I've been telling people too is that my therapist really likes this title. She thinks it's going to be very popular with therapists. As far as color schemes, I've told every when you get published, when they put your book out, the publisher usually sends you a questionnaire and asks for your opinion. And some contracts they have to care and some they don't. But I've always said, I hate red and orange. It's just a thing. That's the way it is. I wish I could explain it, but I am very aesthetically interested in colors, and I don't like those 2 colors at all. I was secretly so happy that I got to go teach at a school whose colors were navy and silver. That was great. I didn't have to wear red. And so the first designs that Joe and Colin, the book jacket designer, came up with were full of red and orange. And I was a crybaby about it. I try to be really agreeable in the editing process, but I threw up some objections to that. And I got to meet finally Joe in person not too long ago. And he and his partner were very excited to show me a picture on their phone. They had been skiing up in Vermont. And I had just rejected yet another book cover, and they were at wit's end with me. And they saw somebody walk by with a jacket, a ski jacket in exactly these colors, blue with orange lines going across. And they were like, that's it. And they sent a picture to Colin, the designer. And Colin, if you're out there somewhere, I really owe you a drink sometime for all I put you through with this book jacket. So, I'm an agreeable person. There's orange on this. I saw it and I really liked it. This was one that really stood out to me. I did ask though, I'm like, Joe, you got to do me a favor. The interior boards, please don't make them orange. Please, just for me, no orange. The other thing, I hate feet. There was a time in the late 90s, early 2000s when every book cover had bare feet or shoes on them. Mm-hmm. And that was the other thing that I would always ask for. No red, no orange, no feet. Please, I'll go with almost anything else. So that's my little diva fit that I threw while getting this book out into the world. I hope that Joe would say that the rest of the time I was a good boy.
Well, yeah, I think it turned out beautifully. And their books kind of publishing world goes through its phases to colors and designs that they like. So I think this one's nice and unique and will look very nice on the shelf.
It looks nice behind you, Emily. Yeah, Thank you. It reminds me a lot of like a mid-'80s Raymond Carver cover. And I don't always try to write like Raymond Carver, but the part of me who wanted to be published in the 80s is very, very happy that I have a Carver cover now. That makes me happy.
Well, good. Well, I think that we are just about out of time. So Chris, thank you so much for being here.
Emily, thank you. And thanks everybody watching. And thanks to the folks who asked questions. You know where to find me if we didn't get to your question. You can certainly ask. I'm at home. I got nothing else to do. Write to me about writing and stories and all of that.
Actually, speaking of being at home, there was one more question someone else asked and I was going to ask as well.
Okay.
So we've all had a lot of time at home, or many of us have recently. Is there anything great you've been reading or anything new you'd like to recommend?
Yeah, I'm reading a couple of student manuscripts right now, which are fantastic, as always. I read, the writer's name is escaping me. I read a science fiction novel called Nine Fox Gambit right at the beginning of summer that I liked a lot. You know what? And I've got a whole bunch of new stuff lined up. I have to admit it, the book that really sucked me in this summer was a friend of mine convinced me to read Dickens' Bleak House.
Did not expect that to be your answer.
I didn't expect to spend a long time reading Bleak House either. That book is too long. It's problematic. It's sexist as hell. It's about Victorian London. It was written as a serial novel. It's indulgent in every way possible. And at the end of it, I cried like a little damn baby. But I've got a whole bunch of stuff. I've been finally finishing reading N.K. Jemison's, Great Broken Earth trilogy. That's fantastic. I should also promote, I'm reading, still finishing up, because I know she's watching, Delphinium Books that took this, they're publishing another Reno author. Her book is coming out very soon, Laura Newman. She's fantastic. You might, if you're watching this and you live in Reno, you might know Laura from winning the short fiction contest in the News and Review. Mm-hmm. So I'm very excited about her book coming out. I'm reading some other things I can't quite talk about just yet. Because, they're either blurbs or things I'm reading for, like work behind the scenes.
Right. Well, great. We'll all go out and read some Dickens.
You don't have to read Dickens. Again, right? Like, there's a whole bunch of stuff that you should probably read before Dickens, but you got to be honest and report what sucked me in.
Right. Hey, what's good is good. So. Well, thank you again, Chris, for being here. Thank you, everyone, for watching. If you want Chris's book, we have it here at the store. You can call us at 775-786-1188 and order it over the phone. You can order it on our website at sundancebookstore.com, or if you put a mask on, you can come to the store weekdays 9 to 7, weekends 9 to 5. And also keep your mask over your nose, please. But we do have copies here, and you're welcome to come by, look at it, and pick it up.
Also, too, I've been signing books for people who order off your website. If you order off the Sundance website, you can ask for personalization. I'm not far away. I will go by periodically and sign and inscribe books for people if you ask, and I will wear a mask and gloves when I do it.
Yes, great. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Have a good night. Thanks.
Be safe. Be safe.
Yes. All right.
Okay.
Bye.